Section 1. Opening scene and context: May 1945. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally just days ago, and the machinery of occupation is grinding to life. In a facility somewhere in southern Germany, an American officer sits across a table from one of the most senior surviving commanders of Nazi Germany. The man's name is Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and he is 69 years old, exhausted, and now a prisoner of war. He has been captured for less than a week. Rundstedt commanded the defense of France against the Allied invasion. He oversaw the armies that fought from Normandy all the way to the Rhine. He was the highest-ranking German field officer in the Western Theater, and his name alone carried weight throughout the Wehrmacht hierarchy. Now he sits across from American intelligence officers who have a simple question for him. They want to know why Germany lost. When Rundstedt speaks, his answer is clinical, professional, and comes from the perspective of someone who spent his entire life studying military science. He gives them 3 reasons. First, he says, the absolute superiority of Allied air power, which made all daylight movement impossible. Second, the catastrophic lack of motor fuel, which paralyzed the panzer divisions and grounded the Luftwaffe. Third, the systematic destruction of the railway network, making it impossible to move supplies or reinforcements across the Rhine. 3 factors. Air. Fuel. Rails. Clean military answers from a professional soldier who had forgotten more about warfare than most men would ever know. His explanation is methodical, logical, and it is remarkably incomplete. There is something he does not mention. There is something he cannot see. There is something that his entire military tradition, stretching back centuries into Prussian history, had never taught him to recognize as a weapon. He does not mention the trucks. Not the trucks that carried ammunition. Not the trucks that carried fuel or food or medical supplies. Not the standard logistical trucks that kept any army functioning. He does not mention the other trucks. The ones that carried donut machines. The ones that carried phonograph records and coffee urns. The ones that carried copies of Stars and Stripes, a newspaper written by soldiers for soldiers, edited with complete independence from military censorship. The ones that were driven by women. College-educated women from Connecticut and Indiana and Virginia who had volunteered to follow the United States Army across an entire continent for the sole purpose of handing a 19-year-old rifleman a hot donut and asking him where he was from. Rundstedt does not mention those trucks because he could not see them. Not because they were hidden or camouflaged or particularly stealthy. He could not see them because they existed in a category that his entire military education and worldview had no name for. The Wehrmacht had precise terminology for firepower. It had sophisticated doctrine for maneuver. It had elaborate supply systems for logistics. But it had no word, no concept, no framework for understanding what the Americans were doing when they sent a 2.5-ton GMC truck full of pastries and American popular music to a crossroads 3 miles behind the fighting, staffed it with 3 young women who knew how to crack a joke and pour coffee in a snowstorm, and let it sit there while exhausted infantrymen lined up in the mud for something that had nothing militarily to do with winning a battle and everything to do with winning a war. This is the story of those trucks. It is the story of the women who drove them. It is the story of a nation that understood something about warfare, about morale, about the nature of human beings in combat, that the most powerful military machine in Europe never learned. And it begins not in World War II, but in the first one, in a flooded tent on the Western Front in October of 1917, where a woman from Huntington, Indiana, dropped to her knees on a dirt floor and fried 7 donuts in a small pan over an open flame. Section 2. The Salvation Army Genesis story. Her name was Helen Purviance, and she was 28 years old when she arrived in France in 1917, just months after the United States entered the First World War. She came with the Salvation Army, a Christian charitable organization that had volunteered to bring spiritual and emotional support to American soldiers far from home. Purviance was already an officer in the Salvation Army, which meant she had dedicated her life to their mission of service. When the War Department called for volunteers willing to travel to France and work directly with the American Expeditionary Force, she stepped forward. The journey took 2 weeks. Purviance traveled alongside roughly 250 other Salvation Army volunteers, most of them women, who would be scattered across the front lines in small groups. Their mission was ambitious but straightforward. They would establish huts near the front lines where soldiers could come for religious services, entertainment, letters to home, and basic human connection. They would remind soldiers that people still cared about them, even here, even in this place where death fell from the sky and the mud consumed everything. Purviance and her partner, Ensign Margaret Sheldon, were assigned to the camp of the 1st Ammunition Train of the 1st Division near the village of Montiers-sur-Saulx in eastern France. When they arrived in early October 1917, they found soldiers who were not just tired. They were destroyed. The area had endured 36 consecutive days of rain. The mud was knee-deep. The trenches were waterlogged. Men stood in freezing water for days at a time, their feet rotting with trench foot, their spirits shattered by cold and monotony and the constant knowledge that death was just a few hundred yards away. Initially, Purviance and Sheldon tried to provide what they had planned to provide. They held religious services. They showed pictures on a Victrola. They made pies and fudge with whatever supplies they could scrounge from the camp kitchens and the limited rations available to them. But the demand was overwhelming, and the supply was minimal. The soldiers appreciated these efforts, but something was missing. Something small. Something ordinary. Something that would make them feel, for just a few minutes, like they were home again. The historical record does not agree on exactly who suggested donuts. Some accounts credit Sheldon. Others credit Purviance. But what matters is that someone realized that donuts were possible. The standard American military ration contained the ingredients: flour, sugar, lard, baking powder. Everything was there. What was not there was any proper equipment, which meant everything had to be improvised. Purviance used a wine bottle as a rolling pin. When she did not have a proper cutter for the center hole, she improvised even further. She and Sheldon used spent artillery shell casings. The small brass casings from the guns that fired overhead became cutting tools in their hands. The frying pan was small and unreliable, capable of cooking only 7 donuts at a time. Purviance later recalled the moment in simple, direct language. She said, "I was literally on my knees when those first donuts were fried, 7 at a time, in a small frying pan." The first donut from that pan went to a soldier named Private Braxton Zuber of Alabama. He took one bite and, according to the accounts that have survived, reportedly said something that has echoed through history. "If this is war, let it continue," he said. It was a moment of perfect, accidental poetry. The soldier had not eaten anything warm and made with care in months. He tasted not just fried dough and sugar. He tasted home. The next day, Purviance and Sheldon made 300 donuts. The day after that, they made 500. Within weeks, as word spread through the division and then through the Corps and eventually through the entire American Expeditionary Force, production at various Salvation Army stations climbed higher and higher. 2,000 donuts per day. Then 5,000. Then 9,000. Some were fried in steel helmets over open fires. Some were made in abandoned farmhouse kitchens in villages that had been destroyed and then partly rebuilt. The tools were always improvised. The demand was always greater than the supply. A young Salvation Army volunteer named Stella Young, only 20 years old, was stationed near the Metz front when a German shell landed close enough to send shrapnel tearing through her tent and through the donut pan. She had stepped away for an ingredient just moments before. She could have been killed. Instead, she went back to frying donuts. The war did not stop for kitchen work. The work did not stop for the war. Fewer than 250 Salvation Army volunteers served in France during the entire First World War. Most of them were women. They were not nurses. They received no military rank or formal military status. They had no weapons and no formal obligation to be where they were. They were there by choice, and many of them moved so close to the front lines that they came under fire. The soldiers called them the Doughnut Lassies, and the name stuck in a way that nothing else did. When Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who served as an officer in France, wrote about his experience after the war, he said something that captured the shift in perception. Before the war, I felt that the Salvation Army was composed of a well-meaning lot of cranks. Now what help I can give them is theirs. A man who had been skeptical had been converted by what he witnessed. The impact was not subtle. What Purviance and Sheldon had discovered, without any formal study or doctrine behind it, was something that military thinkers would spend the next 100 years trying to articulate and systematize. The doughnut itself was not nutritious. A soldier could get more calories from his ration tin. The doughnut was not strategic or tactical. It did not win battles. It did not move divisions. It did not destroy enemy fortifications. What the doughnut was a transaction. An exchange. A ritual between the soldier and the country he was fighting for, conducted through the hands of a woman who had volunteered to stand in a war zone for the specific purpose of making him feel like a person instead of a serial number. It was, in a way that nobody involved could have explained at the time, an act of national intimacy. The country reached out through that doughnut and said, "I see you. I know you are cold and frightened and far from home. Here is something warm." Section 3. The American industrial mindset and morale. When the First World War ended, the soldiers came home. They had survived, or they had not. They came home changed. But they remembered. They remembered the mud and the shells and the gas. And they remembered the doughnuts. That memory created something unprecedented. It created demand. Doughnuts were not particularly popular in America before the First World War. They were a regional specialty in some cities, known to some people, unknown to most. But soldiers who had eaten them in France carried the memory home. They craved them. They sought them out. And when the military recognized what was happening, it took a step that seems strange today but made perfect sense at the time. It published a how-to manual. Guides for veterans who wanted to open doughnut shops. Government assistance. Support. The message was clear. America had sent men across an ocean to fight for democracy. Those men had been sustained by doughnuts. Now America would help them become doughnut businessmen. In 1938, the Salvation Army established National Doughnut Day in Chicago, set for the first Friday of June, to honor the women who had served in France. It was a small commemoration of a small thing. Nobody at that ceremony in 1938 imagined that within 3 years, doughnuts would be industrialized on a scale that would make the entire war machine of the first conflict look like a rehearsal. But between the wars, something else happened that would make the scaling up possible. The United States had become, without quite intending it, the most logistics-capable nation on Earth. The country that Henry Ford had taught to build automobiles on assembly lines. The country that had electrified its cities and connected them with highways and railroads and telephone wires. The country that had figured out how to mass-produce everything from canned soup to motion pictures. That was about to apply that same industrial mentality to the problem of keeping a soldier's spirits up in a foxhole 10,000 miles from home. This is important to understand. Germany had superior tanks. Germany had excellent small unit tactics. Germany had professional officer corps trained in the Prussian military tradition. But Germany did not have assembly lines. Germany did not have a culture of standardization and mass production. Germany did not have the ability to say, "We are going to make a system that delivers a hot donut to the man standing next to the tank." The Germans could build better weapons. The Americans could build a system that delivered a taste of home. Section 4. The Club Mobile system born when the United States entered the Second World War after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the American Red Cross was given official responsibility for providing welfare and recreation services to the armed forces overseas. This was not a small task. This was a massive undertaking that would eventually involve thousands of people, millions of dollars, and logistical challenges that rivaled the supply of ammunition. The man who shaped what this responsibility would look like in the European theater was Harvey D. Gibson, a prominent New York banker who had actually served with the American Red Cross in France during the First World War. Gibson had watched what the Salvation Army had done with almost no resources. He had seen the impact of a woman handing a donut to a frightened young man. Now he had a new question. What would happen if you took that same idea, that simple idea that a hot donut and a familiar face could hold a soldier together when nothing else could, and you industrialized it? What would happen if you scaled it up using all the resources of the American system? The answer was the Club Mobile. The first ones were adapted buses. London Green Line single-decker buses, converted and retrofitted with the most sophisticated mobile kitchen equipment that American ingenuity could devise. Each bus had a built-in donut machine. A Primus stove for heating water for coffee. A phonograph with loudspeakers. A small lounge area in the back where soldiers could sit down out of the rain for 10 minutes and talk to someone who was not trying to kill them. The buses were designed to drive to wherever American troops were stationed in Britain, park, and serve. But when the invasion of Europe began in June 1944, buses would not work. An army advancing across a continent needed mobility. It needed vehicles that could navigate destroyed roads and muddy fields. It needed something smaller. The Red Cross converted approximately 100 GMC trucks, the same 2.5-ton trucks that carried ammunition and fuel and everything else the American Army needed to fight. But these trucks were different. These trucks had been transformed into mobile recreation centers. Each truck had the same equipment. A donut machine built into the chassis. A Primus stove. Coffee urns. Stacks of magazines and newspapers. A phonograph and a collection of the latest American records. A small space in the back where soldiers could sit down. The trucks were named. Every single truck had a name, and soldiers remembered those names the way they remembered the names of their loved ones at home. Cheyenne. Daniel Boone. St. Louis. These were not just vehicles. They were embassies of home. The Doughnut Corporation of America loaned the Red Cross 468 donut machines. Each machine could produce 48 dozen donuts per hour. Do the mathematics. That is 576 donuts per machine per hour. Multiply that across 468 machines running in shifts across the European and Pacific theaters, day after day, month after month for years. You begin to understand the scale of what the Americans built. Between 1939 and 1946, the American Red Cross purchased enough flour to produce 1.6 billion donuts. 1,600,000,000 fried pastries. At peak production in 1944 and 1945, the system was turning out 400 donuts per minute. Think about that number. Not per hour. Per minute. 400 donuts. Every 60 seconds. Around the clock. A single monthly report for December 1944 recorded that 205 Red Cross women stationed in Great Britain alone served 4,659,728 donuts in 31 days. That is not a misprint. Almost 4,700,000 donuts in 1 month in one theater by one group of women. The machinery ran continuously. The supply chains functioned. The system worked. Section 5. Who were the donut dollies? The trucks could not drive themselves. The machines could not run themselves. The donuts could not make themselves. The entire system required people, and the Red Cross had clear ideas about what kind of people it needed. Not just anyone. Not women who simply wanted to help. The Red Cross knew that these women would be standing in front of hundreds of young men every single day, many of whom had not spoken to an American woman in months, some of whom had just rotated off the line and were not entirely sure they were still alive. The Red Cross established specific requirements. Applicants had to be between 25 and 35 years old. They had to be college graduates. They had to be single. In the Red Cross's own language, they had to be healthy, physically hardy, sociable, and attractive. This last criterion would be controversial by modern standards, but it reflected the thinking of the time. The Red Cross believed, whether correctly or not, that appearance mattered for the job they were hiring for. The acceptance rate was brutal. Only 1 in 6 applicants was selected. That is a higher rejection rate than many combat units. The women who made it through the process were sent to American University in Washington, D.C., for training. They received multiple immunizations. They were fitted for Red Cross uniforms and issued 10 pages of specific uniform regulations. No earrings. No brilliant nail polish. No excessive use of cosmetics. Hair had to be neat and professional. Collars had to be pinned a specific way. The Red Cross was not hiring women. It was creating ambassadors. Each woman who wore that uniform was representing the entire United States. The training program went far beyond uniform standards. These women were trained in vehicle maintenance because they would be driving and repairing their own trucks. They were trained in how to make coffee and donuts in confined spaces under difficult conditions. They were trained in how to identify the sound of incoming artillery and distinguish between outgoing and incoming fire, a skill that took most infantry replacements about a week to develop and that the Red Cross understood they had to teach because these women were going to be living with that sound. But there was another skill they trained for, one that sounds strange until you understand what these women were actually going to do. They were trained in how to talk to soldiers. How to make eye contact. How to listen. How to remember a name and use it the next time a man came to the window. How to say something specific and human and real to every person who stepped up, not because regulations required it, but because that moment of individual recognition was the entire point of the operation. The daily routine of a Club Mobile crew was physically punishing. 3 women to a truck. They woke before dawn and mixed donut batter while the truck was still being driven to its assigned location. They heated the oil and began frying while moving. They served for hours at a stretch, standing at the side of the truck in rain or snow or heat, pouring coffee, handing out donuts, making small talk with an unbroken line of soldiers. Some of those soldiers had rotated off the line an hour before. Some of them would be going back on it within hours. The women were expected to be cheerful. Not superficially cheerful. Genuinely cheerful. They were expected to remember names. They were expected to make eye contact and say something that was not a platitude or a script but something real. A soldier could get food from a mess truck. What he could not get from a mess truck was the feeling that someone from home had come all the way to a war zone to see him personally. Section 6. The staggering scale of operations. The Red Cross operation in Great Britain alone was extraordinary in its scale. The Rainbow Corner Club in London, one of the most famous rest facilities of the entire war, served as many as 60,000 meals in a single 24-hour period. That is not a typographical error. 60,000 meals in one day in one building for American servicemen on leave in the capital of an allied nation that was itself rationing food. The club had a dance floor, a barber shop, a tailor, a photographer, a mail room, a cafeteria. It was open around the clock. When American soldiers came in from the cold and rain of an English winter, they walked into a building that felt like a bus station in Cleveland or a diner in Philadelphia. That was intentional. Every detail was designed to reproduce as closely as possible the texture of American civilian life in a country that was 5,000 miles from home. But the clubmobiles were only one piece of what the American military had built. The morale infrastructure that followed the United States Army across Europe was so vast, so logistically demanding, and so thoroughly integrated into the way America fought that it deserves to be described in full, because nothing like it had ever existed before, and the Germans had no equivalent for any of it. On June 29, 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in North Africa sent a cable to the War Department requesting equipment for 10 portable Coca-Cola bottling plants, 3 million filled bottles, and enough supplies to produce that quantity twice a month. Coca-Cola. The President, Robert Woodruff, had made a public commitment in 1941 that every man in uniform would get a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever he was and whatever it cost the company. It was a propaganda gesture, perhaps, but it was also a commitment that took decades to fulfill. The 10 plants eventually became 64 portable Coca-Cola bottling plants deployed across every theater of the war, operated by 148 civilian technical observers dressed in army fatigues with officer rank and pay. The soldiers called them the Coca-Cola Colonels. By the end of the war, more than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola had been consumed by American military personnel. 5 billion bottles. In a country where Coca-Cola was a luxury, in regions where clean drinking water was scarce, the United States created an infrastructure to deliver ice-cold Coca-Cola to young men in combat. The Army's daily newspaper, Stars and Stripes, was revived in London in April 1942. By January 1945, it was being printed simultaneously at as many as 25 locations and had a daily circulation exceeding 1.2 million copies. It was editorially independent. General Eisenhower himself personally championed and protected that independence, insisting that no official control would be exercised over the material that went into Stars and Stripes. The result was a newspaper that published Bill Molden's Willie and Joe cartoons, which regularly mocked officers and army bureaucracy alongside war news and baseball scores. General George S. Patton wrote furious letters to the paper complaining about the cartoons. The paper published them anyway. The United Service Organizations, the USO, was putting on roughly 700 shows per day by the time Germany surrendered. By the war's end, approximately 7,300 entertainers had performed in 420,000 shows across every theater, playing to a combined audience of 130 million service member attendances. Bob Hope traveled more than 80,000 miles during the war, performing in hospitals, on airfields, on the decks of ships, and sometimes close enough to the front that he could hear the guns. Behind all of this was a doctrine, even if nobody called it that at the time. General George C. Marshall articulated it at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, on June 15, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. He said, "It is not enough to fight. It is the spirit which we bring to the fight that decides the issue. It is morale that wins the victory." Eisenhower would later write in his memoir, Crusade in Europe, that morale is the greatest single factor in successful war. These were not throwaway lines. Marshall meant them as strategic principles. At its wartime peak in 1945, the American Red Cross had 7.5 million volunteers and 39,000 paid staff. It operated nearly 2,000 recreation facilities abroad, staffed by approximately 5,000 paid workers. It received $784 million in contributions during the war years. It was by any measure one of the largest volunteer mobilizations in human history, and its purpose was not to fight the war but to sustain the people who were fighting it. Section 7. Life behind the lines in the weeks after D-Day. 10 club mobile groups, each consisting of 8 trucks, crossed the English Channel and landed on the Normandy beaches. Approximately 320 women in the initial wave drove their own trucks off the landing craft, through the wreckage of the invasion, and into a country that was still being fought over field by field. They drove through the Bocage country where American infantry was dying at a rate worse per yard than anything in the First World War. They set up at crossroads and field hospitals and ammunition depots, wherever they could find a concentration of soldiers and a flat place to park. The trucks were camouflaged with moss green netting to avoid being spotted by Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. The women learned to identify the sound of incoming artillery and to distinguish between outgoing and incoming fire, a skill that took most infantry replacements about a week to develop. Some of the clubmobiles were configured as cinemobiles, carrying movie projectors, portable stages, and even pianos. Others carried nothing but donut machines and coffee. All of them carried something that no machine could produce. The presence of an American woman who knew the right slang, who knew how to talk about baseball and Glenn Miller and apple pie, who could look a 20-year-old soldier in the eye and make him feel for 5 minutes like he was back in the world he had left behind. Some of the women had to go on foot when the roads were impossible, carrying donuts and coffee to soldiers through terrain that the trucks could not navigate. Others helped load aircraft with donuts in the Mediterranean, getting supplies to men stationed on islands and airfields that the club mobile trucks could never reach. In September 1944, in a village in liberated France, a photographer named Margaret Karch documented a moment that captures the reach of the clubmobile's influence. French children, many of whom had been living under German occupation for 4 years, were sampling their first American donuts at a clubmobile stop. The truck had been sent for the soldiers, but the children had gathered around it the way children gather around anything new, and the women had done what anyone from home would have done. They fed the children, too. One of those women was Jill Pitts Knappenberger. She was assigned to the 8th Corps with the club mobile named Cheyenne, alongside her crew mates Phyllis McClellan and Helen Anderson. Knappenberger's war took her from the siege of Brest in Brittany to the Battle of the Bulge to the crossing of the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. She earned a European Theatre of Operations ribbon with 5 battle stars, which is more than many infantrymen received. The Red Cross officially did not recognize combat service. These women were not soldiers. And yet many of them were exposed to the same dangers, the same horrors, the same evidence of war's reality that any soldier was. Phyllis McClellan, Knappenberger's crewmate on the Cheyenne, kept a diary through the entire war. She wrote about the cold and the mud and the fatigue. She wrote about the soldiers. She wrote about the faces of young men who had been in combat for weeks and who lit up when the club mobile appeared, not because of the donuts, but because the truck meant that the world behind them still existed. McClellan's group went from Normandy to the Bavarian Alps, through the liberation of Paris to the Battle of the Bulge to the liberation of Buchenwald. She saw the concentration camp. She saw what the war had actually been about. She carried those memories quietly for the rest of her life. Her son, the novelist Luis Alberto Urrea, eventually drew on her diaries for a novel published in 2023 called Goodnight Irene, which brought the story of the club mobile women to a readership that had never heard of them. Another woman was Elizabeth Ann Richardson of Mishawaka, Indiana. Liz, as everyone called her, was a 1940 graduate of Milwaukee Downer College. She served on clubmobiles in England and France and was promoted to captain in charge of club mobile operations at Le Havre, one of the great American supply ports on the French coast. In a letter to her parents in September 1944, she wrote, "I consider myself fortunate to be in Club Mobile. Cannot conceive of anything else. It is a rugged and irregular and weird life, but it is wonderful." To a college friend, she wrote something that captures the spirit of the entire Club Mobile service. She said, "Damn glad I have a degree. It helps so much in making donuts." On the morning of July 25, 1945, 2 months after Germany's surrender, Liz Richardson boarded a Piper Cub light aircraft in Lille to fly to Paris for orders reassigning her to Germany. Near Rouen, the plane flew into heavy fog and crashed. Liz Richardson was killed. She was 27 years old. The pilot, Sergeant William R. Miller of the 9th Air Force, also died. Liz Richardson is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, Plot A, Row 21, Grave 5. She is one of only 4 women buried there, among the thousands of soldiers who died taking the beaches she had spent a year serving donuts behind. 86 American Red Cross workers lost their lives during the Second World War. 52 of them were women. 34 were men. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. They had no military obligation to be where they were. They went because they believed that the men doing the fighting deserved someone to remind them of home. And some of them died for that belief. Section 8. German morale systems and philosophy. To understand why the German military never built anything like the Club Mobile system, you have to understand what they built instead. The Wehrmacht was not indifferent to morale. It had its own welfare infrastructure, organized under the term Truppenbetreuung, which translates roughly as troop care. The system was administered through the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, the Reich Chamber of Culture, and the Nazi Party's leisure organization, Kraft durch Freude, which means strength through joy. Kraft durch Freude ran front theater troops and front theater groups that performed plays and variety shows for soldiers behind the lines. It operated soldier cinemas and soldier homes, the Soldatenheim, which were rest facilities where men could sleep in a bed, take a bath, and eat a meal that was not field rations. It ran frontline book vans, the Front which distributed reading material. It operated the Wehrmacht's forces radio network, the Wehrmacht Sender, which included the famous Brigade station that broadcast Lili Marleen, the song that became the unofficial anthem of every soldier on every side of the war. Some of this was genuinely effective. Lili Marleen was so popular with Allied troops that the BBC eventually broadcast its own version. But the system was philosophically different from the American approach in three ways that mattered profoundly. First, it was state propaganda. Every piece of entertainment, every newspaper, every film shown in a Soldatenheim was controlled by the propaganda ministry. There was no Stars and Stripes, no editorially independent newspaper where a cartoonist could mock the commanding general and keep his job. There was no free press in the foxhole. The German soldier received information that had been filtered through Nazi ideology. Second, it was built on the assumption of conquest. The Wehrmacht's logistics, including its food supply, were designed around the idea that the army would live off the land in conquered territory. This worked in France. It worked for a time in the Soviet Union. But it meant that when the land could no longer be lived off, when the army was pushed back onto German soil or into places where there was nothing left to take, the entire system began to collapse. Third, and most importantly, there was no equivalent of the donut dolly. There was no system that sent women from home to the front with no purpose other than to remind soldiers of the country they had left behind. The German soldier's contact with home was the Feldpost, the military mail system, and whatever Kraft durch Freude programming reached his sector. He did not have a woman from his own country hand him a donut and ask him about his hometown. He had ideology. He had discipline. He had speeches about fighting for the Reich. What he did not have was something that felt personal. The German military, which prided itself on understanding the psychology of combat, never built the one thing that the American system proved was more effective than ideology at sustaining a soldier's will to fight. They never built a connection to home that felt personal rather than political. That was perhaps the greatest strategic miscalculation of the entire war. Section 9. The crucial difference Germans missed. The daily reality of a German frontline soldier in the last 2 years of the war was a study in declining standards that the Wehrmacht's leadership was unable to arrest. The bread ration, which had been a source of quiet pride in the German army for its reliability, began to include increasing quantities of filler. Margarine replaced butter. Artificial honey replaced sugar. Ersatz coffee, brewed from roasted barley or acorns, replaced the real thing. Cigarettes, often manufactured in Spain specifically for Wehrmacht distribution, were tightly rationed and frequently unavailable. Chocolate was a luxury reserved for special rations. There was no ice cream. There was no Coca-Cola. There were no portable bottling plants following the army. There was, in the late stages of the war, often nothing except what the soldiers could scavenge from the land they were retreating through or the supplies they could capture from the enemy. Compare that to what an American soldier in the same theater had access to in the same month. He received a daily ration of approximately 3,500 calories. He had near universal access to chocolate, chewing gum, and cigarettes. He could drink Coca-Cola bottled in a portable plant somewhere in France. He could get hot donuts and coffee from a Club Mobile. He could read that morning's Stars and Stripes. He could, on occasion, see a USO show performed in a barn or a field within the sound of the guns. He could write home on stationery provided by the Red Cross and know that the letter would be carried by a mail system that functioned with remarkable efficiency even in combat conditions. If he was wounded, he would be treated in a hospital system that, while imperfect, was the most advanced and best supplied in any army in the world. The disparity was so extreme that when German prisoners of war reached American camps in the United States, many of them ate better than they had eaten in the Wehrmacht. They were served the same rations as American soldiers in the mess hall. The food was abundant and varied. The contrast with what they had endured on the front line was so stark that it became, in an ugly irony, a source of acute domestic controversy. At camps across the American South, German prisoners of war and white American soldiers ate at the same tables, while black American soldiers who served as guards were segregated to separate facilities. But the basic fact remained. The American system worked. It kept soldiers believing that their country cared about them. It kept them connected to home. It kept their spirits up when every rational calculation said they should have broken. When the German generals were interrogated after the war, they spoke endlessly about material superiority. They wrote tens of thousands of pages about American air power, American armor, American industrial production. But almost none of them wrote about the system that kept the American soldier believing that the country behind him actually cared whether he lived or died. That system, the Doughnut Trucks and the coffee urns and the USO shows and the daily newspapers and the portable Coca-Cola bottling plants that followed the army across continents, was not a luxury. It was a weapon. The Germans never recognized it as one, and that failure of recognition is part of why they lost. Section 10. The Human Cost and Sacrifice. On December 5, 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton issued a statement about the Club Mobile women that was circulated to every crew in the 3rd Army's area of operations. Patton was not a man given to sentiment. He once slapped a soldier for crying in a field hospital. When he praised the Club Mobile women, he was not being polite. He was acknowledging a tactical reality. He wrote, "In my opinion, the Club Mobile girls of the American Red Cross have performed and are performing a very major work in maintaining the morale of the frontline troops and in keeping before the eyes of our soldiers the best traditions of apparent American womanhood. The 3rd Army joins me in a respectful and enthusiastic endorsement of the American Red Cross." Patton understood what the academic literature would not catch up with for decades. Morale is not tangential to military effectiveness. Morale is central. Morale determines whether soldiers hold or break. Morale determines whether a line can be maintained or whether it collapses. The German generals, for all their tactical brilliance, had never learned this lesson. One of the Club Mobile women, Helen Stevenson, described a small moment after the war that says more than any statistic. She said that when a Club Mobile pulled up to a convoy, the standard routine was simple. The women would yell out to a truckload of GIs, "Hi, soldier. What's cooking?" And the guys would yell back, "Chicken, want a neck?" It was silly. It was juvenile. It was exactly the kind of exchange that a 20-year-old American male would have had with a young woman in a diner in Ohio or a drugstore in Virginia. That was the point. For 30 seconds, the war was not real. For 30 seconds, the kid in the back of the truck was not a soldier heading toward a line where 1 in 4 of his platoon would be dead within a month. He was just a guy making a bad joke at a pretty girl. And then the truck rolled on and the war came back. But something had been deposited in him that was not there before the truck stopped. The Germans had a word for what they were trying to produce in their own soldiers. They called it Kampfgeist, fighting spirit. They tried to produce it through ideology, through speeches, through the cult of the Führer, through the promise of a 1,000-year Reich. The Americans produced it with a donut and a wisecrack. The American version lasted longer. Section 11. Battle of the Bulge. Context. When the Wehrmacht launched its final major offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, the operation was premised on a confession of total logistical failure. The German plan required capturing American fuel dumps to keep the panzer divisions moving. The offensive could not sustain itself on German supplies alone. The army that had conquered France in 6 weeks and pushed to the gates of Moscow in 5 months was now completely dependent on stealing from the enemy just to move. On December 17, 1944, the spearhead of the attack, Kampfgruppe Paper, under SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, overran an American fuel depot at Boulingen, Belgium, and seized approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline. Paper's troops forced American prisoners of war to refuel the German tanks. It was the kind of scene that would have been unimaginable in 1940 when the Wehrmacht's logistics were the envy of every army in Europe. By 1944, the most elite armored unit in the German military could not advance without stealing fuel from the enemy, and even the stolen fuel was not enough. Paper's advance stalled within days because there was no more American gasoline to take. While Paper's men were siphoning American fuel at gunpoint, American soldiers in the same theater were receiving hot donuts from Club Mobile trucks. They were reading that morning's Stars and Stripes. They were drinking Coca-Cola bottled in a portable plant somewhere in France. In some cases, they were watching a USO show that had been organized in a barn behind the lines 3 days after the German attack began. The American system did not stop during the Battle of the Bulge. It kept running. The clubmobiles kept serving. Jill Pitts-Knappenberger and the crew of the Cheyenne were in the Ardennes that December. They did not leave. Think about what that means. The most dangerous German offensive since 1940. The attack that would produce more than 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. The battle that came closer than any other engagement on the Western Front to breaking the American line. And the Doughnut Trucks stayed. They stayed because the women driving them understood something that Paper, with all his tactical brilliance, did not. They understood that the soldiers who were going to stop the German offensive needed more than ammunition. They needed to know that someone behind them was still thinking of them as human beings. The truck at the crossroads was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. Not for the body, but for the thing inside the body that makes a man stand up when every instinct is telling him to stay down. Section 12. Legacy and recognition. It took 67 years. On May 23, 2012, the United States Senate passed Resolution 471, commending the women of the American Red Cross Clubmobiles for exemplary service during the Second World War. Senator Susan Collins, sponsoring the resolution, said, "A visit from a club mobile was one of the most significant events for a young GI in combat far from home." 67 years for official national recognition. The women who had driven those trucks through Normandy and the Ardennes and across the Rhine, the ones who were still alive in 2012, were in their late 80s and 90s by then. Many had never spoken publicly about what they had done. Many had tucked their diaries and their photographs into drawers and gotten on with the business of living, the way veterans of every war do when the war recedes and the country that asked them to serve moves on to the next thing. Liz Richardson is still at Normandy, Plot A, Row 21, Grave 5. She is 27 years old forever. She will never be older than the war that killed her. Her grave is in the same cemetery as the men who stormed the beaches she served behind. The men who lined up in the mud for a donut and a joke and 5 minutes of feeling like they had not been forgotten. Field Marshal Rundstedt listed 3 reasons for Germany's defeat. Air superiority, fuel, railways. He was not wrong about any of them. But he missed the 4th reason. The one that was parked at every crossroads and every field hospital and every ammunition dump. The one that was driven by women who had volunteered to follow an army into a war because they believed it mattered. He missed the truck. And because he missed the truck, he missed the war. The German generals understood firepower. They understood maneuver. They understood supply, at least until they ran out of things to supply. They understood the mechanics of killing and the mechanics of movement. What they did not understand was the mechanics of caring. The German military tradition, for all its brilliance, was built on a fundamental assumption about the relationship between a state and its soldiers. The assumption was that the soldier existed to serve the state. His purpose was the mission. His value was his utility. His morale was to be sustained through ideology, through discipline, through the belief that he was fighting for something greater than himself. The American military tradition, which was younger and messier and far less theoretically sophisticated, was built on a different assumption. It assumed that the state existed to serve the soldier. Not perfectly. Not without hypocrisy. Not without the grotesque contradictions of racial segregation and institutional callousness. But at its foundation, the American system rested on the idea that the young man in the foxhole had been sent there by a democracy, and that the democracy owed him something in return. It owed him not just equipment and training and leadership. It owed him the acknowledgement that he was a citizen before he was a soldier, and that his comfort, his dignity, and his connection to home were not luxuries to be dispensed with when the budget got tight. They were obligations. The American military in the Second World War, for all its flaws and bureaucracy and waste and racial segregation and imperfection, understood one thing that the Wehrmacht did not. It understood that the man in the foxhole is not a component. He is not a mechanism. He is not an instrument of the state. He is a 19-year-old kid from Indiana or Alabama or New Jersey who has not slept in 3 days and who has watched his friends die and who is being asked to stand up tomorrow morning and do it again. Whether he stands up or whether he breaks is sometimes decided by things that have nothing to do with training or equipment or doctrine. It is decided by whether anyone in the vast machinery behind him has remembered that he is a human being. The donut was never about the donut. It was about the hand that gave it to him. It was about the woman from home who looked him in the eye and said, "Hi, soldier. What is cooking?" And meant it. It was about the fact that his country had spent fuel and shipping tonnage and human lives to get that donut to him. Not because a donut wins battles, but because the man who eats the donut does. The women who drove those trucks, who died in plane crashes and served under shellfire and never once picked up a weapon, understood what Helen Purviance had understood on her knees in a flooded tent in France in 1917. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for a man who is being asked to die for his country is to remind him that his country knows he is alive. If you have a grandmother or great-aunt who served with the Red Cross during the Second World War, I would be honored to read their story. I would like to hear which unit they were assigned to, where they served, what they remembered. Those details, the small, specific, personal things, matter more than any official archive. They are the actual record of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. Every like on this video keeps the story of women like Helen Purviance and Liz Richardson and Dorothy Burge visible a little longer. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. They went anyway, and the men they served never forgot them, even when the rest of the world did. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many stories like this one. Most of them are about ordinary people who decided that someone had to do something, and that the someone was going to be them.